You have somebody hear you about a new one last? You're live. Okay, we're live. This is Senate Transportation. It's Friday, January 26th. We're moving on to S-184, which is an act related to the use of automated traffic law enforcement. And we have some witnesses from public safety and state police that we'll go to. But I will say to our witnesses and to the committee that we're looking that this bill is a specific bill that has a lot of stuff in it about automated traffic law enforcement. But I think we're also interested in different approaches. So we're not only thinking about this as it's listed in the bill, but are there other ways to do this that aren't listed in the bill? Something we'll be looking at. So we have Mandy first. Ms. Worcester, I don't know if you want to, if you or John, it matters to go first. If not, then we'll just have you go first because that's how it's listed in the agenda. So you can introduce yourself and let us know what you have to say.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Mandy Worcester. I'm the Executive Director of Policy Development for the Department of Public Safety. I'd like to thank you for asking me to testify today. If you are all agreeable, I'd like to defer my testimony to Captain Lone, as he is the subject matter expert, and then I could just remain available for any questions you all might have.
That's fine, yeah.
State police is part of the department.
Part of the department, yeah. So that's definitely, that's okay, so yeah. Officer Lone, you want to just introduce yourself for the record and you can commence your testimony.
Yes, sir. And if there's any connection activity like issues, just let me know. I'll switch what Wi-Fi I'm on. My name's Sean Lone. I'm with the Vermont State Police. I'm a captain, the Special Investigations Commander. So I oversee the Vermont Intelligence Center, Narcotic Investigations Unit, and the Fire and Explosion Unit.
Great. Do you have specific testimony on this, or are you here just to answer questions, or have you looked at the bill?
I have looked at the bill. I'm happy to provide my perspective. I did manage the ALPR yearly summary from 2019 to 2022 under the Vermont Intelligence Center. So I do have some experience in managing the sort of the privacy and the auditing part of the use of LPRs. And I think reading the bill, I think it's a great direction for the state. There are some things that I think should be addressed if it moved forward. From the first part would be the use of the Vermont Intelligence Center. It is a federally funded Homeland Security Center, so it can't be involved in civil process like assessing fines and things like that. So I know it was taken from 1607, which is the language for the former ALPR bill, but we'd have to remove that and kind of look at that through who could better manage that data and also the auditing process. And then a couple other things that came up as I was reading it was the issuance of a VCVC, and I'm sure people have heard from different members of the state police that are involved in traffic safety. So I'm only going to speak to this small portion that I know. But the issue of a VCVC, which is a Vermont civil violation complaint, it's essentially a ticket in the state of Vermont. It's a civil complaint. It requires at the bottom of the paper for someone to ask the person if they're on active duty. It's a Service Member Civil Relief Act. And that's required for it to be valid in court or to be, in traffic court. And one of the issues with this bill is because there's no interaction between the people, the use of a VCVC or a ticket, from the state could be problematic because we can't completely fill out that form, and we can't ask the driver or even the owner if they're a member of the active duty member of the armed forces. So those are the two things that stuck out immediately. I think there's a deeper conversation about data retention as well as privacy, civil liberties. A lot of times with ALPR systems, when they're collecting data, they're collecting every plate that comes through. And in that sense, we are collecting a large amount of data about the travel of Vermonters. And our LPR, our current LPR law does a good job explaining what those standards are for the use in criminal situations. But I would say that if we continue to go forward in this, we might want to discuss with some of our or maybe civil liberties, civil rights groups about the data retention side of it and who's going to be managing it and seeing it.
Okay. Is that a federal rule, the Service Member Relief Act, or that's a Vermont statute?
You know, sir, I honestly don't know the answer to that. I just know from working in Vermont, that's required as part of our paperwork.
Okay.
If part of it has to do with if you don't respond, it's like I'm not able to respond because I'm on military service. I think that's the impetus behind it, and I do not
Oh, and
know.
respond to the ticket, like I can't show up because I'm overseas or just on base or something. I see. So,
But I can find out if it's federal requirement.
right, it'd be interesting because if it's federal core requirement, we could see what other states that use these.
And don't have it be a civil violation equivalency.
Right.
But if you're gonna go in the direction of having it not be issued by law enforcement and not go through the judicial bureau, then you kind of potentially bypass.
That's not an issue. Okay. Senator Shitten.
So you opened your commentary, I believe, I recall you saying something, this is a really good or a good direction for the state to go in. And you definitely then highlighted concerns, and I definitely share those concerns. And so I think a better path would be maybe a more incremental step rather than as much as this bill is currently considering. I wonder if you might elaborate though on why you opened with that statement, which I agree with. I'd just love to hear from an expert like yourself. Why do you think this is a good direction for the state to go in?
From what I understand, the intent of the bill is, you know, we have a reduced number of law enforcement. Any kind of action that we could put out there to keep people safer on the highway is a step in the right direction. So, you know, in a bill like this, where you're looking at, I know it initially targets work zones, and it could be expanded as we go on. You know, these are ways to slow down traffic and to allow people to operate safely, but also for workers to be safe on the side of the road. So I think it's one of those things that complements law enforcement, you know, the idea that we can automate some of this. And I would say, as we've had these discussions, there are states that are doing this very successfully, but I would look to states that have similar civil liberties and privacy rule and findings. I look at like New Hampshire and Maine, who are able to use LPRs and automated traffic law enforcement systems, but under a different scope because of findings from their state and basically the way their state's set up. So it's difficult when we compare ourselves to states like New York, who, you know, they're going to slide more towards a larger amount of surveillance for the terrorism side, and they can use a lot of these things. I feel like when we do re-engage this and look at different options, maybe look at some states that are aligned better with us with our privacy and civil liberties, civil rights standards.
Yeah, and as Captain Lone mentioned, we've been talking about, this bill does focuses on specific areas, including work zones. We're talking about maybe just limiting it to work zones, since that's been a priority of this committee. We've had flaggers, and we had the flagger death, and a construction worker, I don't know if it was a flagger that got hit last year, but a construction worker in a work zone got hit again last year. So that seems like be a critical area. And it's also the work zones are defined by where the work needs to be done, so we don't run into an issue of a bias that we're placing these in specific areas because we're targeting the people that are in that area or something like that. So,
yeah, I just want to, you know, I probably have been, I've been asked several different ways that why I'm against the bill. And I'm probably not, and I'm not against the bill. I'm against targeting it. I'd hate to see all of a sudden the town get one of these systems and all of a sudden become that town. I mean, we had a problem up in Island Pond for a lot of years about a law enforcement guy up there, and the state police would go to him and say, well, no, listen, no, you can't stop every vehicle that doesn't have mud flaps on it, because this is the rule and this is the way it is, and that's the way. Well, I don't care. I'll let them handle that in court. And that's where it was, and then it was a big rule. I mean, they had you know, traffic advisories throughout the country, and so those are. I guess you're always worried about abuses. You're worried about all of that. I'm also worried about some things as far as for law enforcement. I think one of the things that we're learning here that in the last couple of days especially is that law enforcement is up as much about education as they are anything. They're not about passing out tickets and then, oh, you gotta go pay this ticket. I mean, but hey, you correct this, we'll waive that ticket. We're hearing that a lot. And I'm also worried about, stopping traffic stops to a point to where you just don't get that lucky break anymore because you're not having any interaction and you're not stopping that vehicle and finding 1,000 bags of heroin in a safe manner, as far as I'm concerned. You didn't have to go kick that door down in there with guns drawn to go in there and take that risk off the street. So those are my concerns. That's where I'm at. I don't know that there's anybody that's probably more pro law enforcement than myself. I just have some concerns about where these are going to be, how they're going to be monitored, and to get away from that interaction with law enforcement that I think is very critical.
Okay, fair enough. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Yes, you referenced New Hampshire and Maine, but we're obviously, when we've had prior discussions around privacy, the collection of data, access to data, that was a great concern. And I'm just wondering, Maine and New Hampshire, was that more in terms of comparability, or were you saying that they would have similar concerns about the privacy and access to data? If we were to look at how they have addressed this, I just wanted could you just clarify how you see they might be states that we could look to?
Yes, ma'am. Well, I'll use the use of LPRs for, I know it's not about this topic, but as an example, for criminal enforcement. So the ACLU monitors ALPRs throughout the US and decides whether or not they find them, reasonable or unreasonable. Their best practices right now, like they actually list the state of New Hampshire. So what the state of New Hampshire does with their criminal side is their LPRs on police cars collect data. But what you have to do is you have to have reasonable suspicion or probable cause to put a vehicle in there. So if you were working a drug case, you'd put the plate in there, you have reasonable suspicion it's tied to a crime. And then all of the data that's collecting throughout the day is deleted every 3 minutes. So it's not retaining the people that are passing it. It isn't as good when you want to do a historical case. So if you have an investigation, you're looking at a murder that happened 6 months ago, you don't have historical data to look back and say, well, this vehicle was in that area. But when it comes to just, proactive criminal enforcement on the ground, pulling cars over. So New Hampshire managed to do that. And then if you look at New Hampshire, the way they use their toll systems, that's all LPRs. Mm-hmm. And that issuance of a ticket, well, a lot of that is used either through a third-party vendor or through another pathway. So it's not law enforcement collecting all this data for a civil issue, because in our state, a lot of states, it's different for our state. So in our state, Title 23, the majority of Title 23 is civil. It's not criminal. That's why we issue the ticket the way we do. In a lot of states, traffic infractions are crimes. They're criminal. So they're treated differently and they have a different standard. So with us, when we're talking about issuing a VCVC or issuing fines based on speed, we're talking about a civil thing, under Title 23. And that's where I think we could look to some other states to see how they're managing that civil non-criminal side, passing through toll booths, going over bridges, things like that would be similar to assess a fine. Just before you spoke, the gentleman was speaking, and I agree with the idea of discretionary. I think it's great that a police officer can teach a lesson on the side of the road, explain why we're doing this, and not have to hand someone a ticket. That's a great feature as in the human contact side of things. There's an education portion. I know it was talked about in some of our meetings about maybe there's a warning system set up with this, that it's not an automatic hit. Maybe it's one warning and then you get a hit, and that's the education portion. But I think there's a lot of parts that we could keep breaking apart and building back up in this to get a solution.
Which is all the more reason why I support a more incremental step than what the bill currently proposes. And I think starting with safe work zones to address those types of concerns and to communicate those to the public and to have the warning system, I think is a great direction to go.
Okay. Ms. Worcester, did you have something you wanted to say? I did have a question for you, because I think you were involved in the primary, secondary enforcement study and report, is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, so I didn't know if this came up in that context about stops in secondary and first primary. Did automatic, use of cameras come up in that context at all?
No, it didn't. When we did this study, we looked at all the statutes in Title 23 that were associated with motor vehicles. This isn't one that we visited, no.
Okay. Because I just wondered if the concern about issues that happen when you're pulling a vehicle over, you avoid that if you're just not pulling them over, so.
That is, yeah, that's accurate. But that isn't something that we visited in that study.
And there's no bias with a camera.
Right, as long as you're not biased where you put it
Yeah.
or something like that, yeah. Or doing something with the data.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, if there's no questions for the witnesses from the Department of Public Safety, then we can move on. Which is because I gotta prepare to present the bill on the floor. But I think we have some other witnesses. We've asked the ACLU and others to come in and testify. But I'll also talk to AOT about maybe presenting a different version of this that kind of gets us in that incremental method of addressing this, going back to what we passed or talked about a few years ago about a work zone pilot. Okay, if there's nothing else, then we thank you for your time, your testimony.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
And if the committee doesn't have anything else to say about these topics or questions for council or it's us, we can go offline or adjourn.
I know you do. So since Michelle Boomhauer is here, I love clarity on what we passed a couple of years ago. Did it not go forward because we didn't authorize the issuance of a ticket and it was just a warning? And so this would, no, I'm getting a no from.
Well, it's a yes and a no kind of thing, so.
Michelle Boomhauer, Agency of Transportation. So the cost estimate to implement even a pilot is around $1 million in terms of engaging a third-party vendor, the equipment, the monitoring and analysis. And so in the prior rendition, we had talked about not issuing fines. And Federal Highway Administration, who would be our funding partner, did not feel that the issuance of warnings was going to have an effective safety reduction or safety enhancement feature because people would not be compliant if there wasn't going to be a fine element. And so the dialogue has moved to the point where we are considering a fine or an assessment, I guess I would call it. So we're trying to stay out of the court systems and the law enforcement framework. And so we'll have more to talk about next week related to what a potential pathway would look like that would allow us to receive the Federal Highway Administration funding to do the actual work that would need to be done to advance this.
And how would you characterize their initial response?
Very positive, very, very positive.
Yeah, you want to give us other historical context? Of
I have a
that?
slightly different answer because it doesn't have any substance to it. It's just like what happened in the building.
Yeah.
The agency, for purposes of the T-bill a few years ago, proposed doing this as a pilot program. It was something that was considered in the House and it was changed into a report. They issued the report. This body considered whether or not the report should be required and went with a report. And then in terms of the phrasing, if you use fine, that's a crime. So you will not see fine mentioned very often in Title 23. You will see it in that Title 13 language about airbags.
Mm-hmm.
The language that's used in Title 23 is civil penalty, and those go to the Judicial Bureau. If it's going to be something that is not a civil penalty, it certainly is not going to be a fine, then assessment might be the correct word.
Yeah.
But I can guarantee you that fine is the wrong word. But everyone in this building uses fine when they mean civil penalty. It's just what people say.
And one of the questions we'll have to deal with is what is the due process for somebody that gets a ticket in the mail or an assessment for going over the speed limit in a work zone, do they go to the Judicial Bureau? You know, who has to show up on the state side? Is it an officer? Is it Michelle Boomhauer does the drive down?
Transportation board.
Transportation board, you're right, yeah.
The appellate, huh?
Right, there, so that's a question that we will have to address, what's the best way to do it. We're looking at other states, you know, as Captain Malone would mention, look at a state that is kind of doing it the way we might want to do it. We think Delaware might be an example, so we're looking at that.
Can we use the word ticket?
I think that you would want to think about that in terms of who is like the issuing entity. If it's coming from a vendor, maybe it's not something you want to call a ticket. In Vermont, you heard Sean Lone say CVC, that's the civil violation complaint, I think is the phrasing of it. And that's the one that would sort of put you on the path.
That's what we call a ticket, but it's really a citation.
Yeah.
So
But
you
again,
might get a citation with
With
an
an
assessment.
assessment.
Citation with an assessment adder.
Uh-huh.
Okay, any other questions, comments?
Next.
Explanations from the peanut gallery? Okay, so we can adjourn for the day.